In this video, you will learn the basics of Wrath of Kings, a tabletop wargame where players take control of powerful creatures and heroes to battle for supremacy. Wrath of Kings can be played as both a skirmish game, with each player taking control of a small group of models, to a full-size wargame featuring dozens of models per side. This is a stat card for Wrath of Kings. It has all the information for each of the units on it. At the top, you will find the model's name. Some models also have a trait, which is listed directly below their name. Traits by themselves don't have any special effects. Certain rules and abilities will trigger off a model having a certain trait. At the bottom of the card, you will find 4 different stats. The first is mobility. This is the maximum number in inches that a model may move when performing its movement. The second symbol is willpower, which represents a model's mental fortitude. While willpower doesn't do anything on its own, several effects and attacks in the game will reference a model's willpower. Next is resilience. This represents how tough a model is. When a model is attacked, a higher resilience will keep it from suffering damage. Lastly, we have wounds. This is a model's total health. Once a model suffers damage equal to their wounds, they are slain and removed as a casualty. Turning the card over, we see some additional information. At the top, we once again see the model's name and traits, but below that, we also see a model's type. These keywords show the model's role in the army, and are primarily used for army construction. To the right of this, we see 4 boxes of additional information. They are a model's rank, which is primarily used for army creation, the size base the model should be mounted on, the model's size, which represents the model's physical profile on the battlefield, primarily for determining what the model can and cannot see. Deployment zone, initialized DZ. When setting up for a game, the model's deployment zone will tell you just where it can be placed on the battlefield at the start of the game. Below this, we see a model's attacks. We'll get more into this later. And at the bottom, we see an area for special abilities. These are all unique powers that the unit has, and each have their own unique special rules. The object of each game of Wrath of Kings is to reduce your enemy's morale to 0, causing their army to retreat off the battlefield. Each player will have a starting morale value. This value is determined by taking the total number of models in your army and dividing it by 3, rounding down. Here we see that both armies have 7 models. They will have 2 morale each. Each player will then add up the total ranks of any leader models in their army and add that to their total. In both cases shown, each army has a single rank 1 leader, meaning that both armies will start with 3 morale, 2 from their army's model count, and 1 from their ranks of leaders. Wrath of Kings is broken up into a number of rounds. During the round, each player will take turns activating their models, going back and forth until one player is out of models to activate. Once this happens, the round ends and a new one begins. At the end of any round, if a player is at 0 or less morale, they lose the game. To determine who begins each round, both players will roll a single 10-sided die. If a player has lower morale than their opponent, they gain a cumulative +1 to this roll for each point of morale they have less than their opponent. The player who rolls highest begins. In this case, both players have 3 morale, so neither player will get a bonus. After rolls are made, player A, playing the Technus army to the right, wins by rolling a 4. Each army is composed of 3 types of models: specialists, such as the Galvanic Defender; infantry, such as the Union Workers; and leaders, such as the Technus Union Boss. The Technus player decides that he is going to activate a single Union Worker. When the model activates, its activation is broken down into 2 parts: its movement and its action. When a model performs its movement, it may move a number of inches equal to its mobility score. While models may have a number of special actions they can take, the most common action will be to attack using one of the attacks listed on the back of its card. In this case, the Union Worker will spend its movement to move forward 5 inches. Unfortunately, the Union Worker's attacks are only useful at close range, so it cannot perform an attack. It can, however, perform a special action known as a sprint. Sprint is a generic action that all models have access to. The sprint action allows a model to move up to 4 inches. Now that the model has completed both its movement and its action, Technus' turn ends and their opponent's turn begins. Their opponent, playing House Nasir, chooses to activate a single Ashman Swordsman. Seeing that his Ashman has a mobility value of 7, he measures to see if he can make it to the Union Worker. The player may measure distance at any time for any reason during the game. Seeing that he is within 7 inches of the Union Worker, the Nasir player moves his Ashman into contact with the Union Worker. The Ashman will now perform its action, choosing to use its attack. For now, we will ignore any special abilities the Ashman has and show you how an attack is resolved. Each model's attack will have the following information: its name, its type, how many dice it rolls, and its range. In the case of the Ashman's Sword Slash attack, we see that it is a melee attack that rolls a single die. Since the range is 0, it means that the Ashman must be in contact with its target in order to use that attack. The Nasir player will roll the die and compare the result to the Union Worker's defense chart. If the result is a strike or an over, then the attacker has succeeded in his attack, potentially damaging the target. Here, we see that a 7 result is a strike on the Union Worker. The defense chart can have numerous results other than strike and over. These represent the different types of defenses the target has, ranging from armor to dodging to magical shields. On their own, these results reflect various ways the attack is missed, but many attacks and special abilities on models will interact with the defense chart in meaningful and unique ways. Now we compare the number of hits to the resilience of the model. Each time the number of hits equals this amount, the target suffers 1 damage. In this case, the Union Worker has a resilience of 1 and has suffered 1 hit, meaning it will suffer 1 damage. Luckily, the Union Worker has 2 wounds, so the 1 damage done by the Ashman is not enough to slay him. The Union Worker will be given a marker to signify his wound. Once this is done, the attack has been completed, thus ending the Ashman's activation. Now back to Technus' turn, let's talk about leaders. Leaders are unique in that they can command the infantry around them. The most notable way of doing so is by issuing a combined activation. What this means is that, instead of activating 1 infantry at a time, a leader can force entire groups of infantry to activate in unison. The amount of infantry a leader can activate is tied to their leadership value, which is in turn tied to the game size that you and your opponent are playing. For this tutorial, we're setting the leadership value to 3, meaning that at the start of your turn, your leader can allow up to 3 nearby infantry to activate during the same turn. One thing to note, however, is that when issuing combined activation, that all models activating must share the same trait. This does mean that your leader can be one of the models activating during this time as well. In this case, we will have the Union Boss activate, along with 2 Union Workers, as they all share the Union member trait on their cards. When performing a combined activation, the player must declare that all models will be performing their movement or their action first. All activating models must follow this order, but do not necessarily have to perform the same action. For this turn, the activated models will perform their move and then their action. The Technus player will move all models forward. He will then perform each of his model's actions, choosing to sprint with the 2 Union Workers, while keeping the Union Boss back out of harm's way. This is important because leaders can only command models that are within 6 inches. We see here that, by leaving the Union Boss where he is, that all Union Workers are within his 6-inch leadership area. Technus' turn is now done. The Nasir turn begins. He chooses to activate his Rathor Specialist. Unlike infantry and leaders, specialists always activate on their own and can never be part of a combined activation. He first performs his move to advance forward 6 inches. Looking at the attacks on the Rathor, we see he has a magic attack with a range of 8 inches. The Nasir player measures to see if the Union Boss is in range and, seeing that he is, chooses it as its target. Rolling his 1 attack die, we see the Rathor has scored a Overpower result. An Overpower result is much like a normal strike, except that causes 2 hits instead of the usual 1. 2 hits are now compared to the Union Boss's resilience of 1, meaning the Union Boss suffers 2 wounds from the attack. After that devastating attack, the Nasir player's turn ends and Technus' begins. He begins by checking his leadership range, making sure all Union Workers are within it. It is important to note that a leader can always command a number of models equal to the leadership value, as long as these models share a trait and have not yet activated. Commanding is a passive ability. It is not a resource that is used up as the commander activates models. The Technus player decides to issue a combined activation to the 2 remaining Union Workers, advancing them up the field via their movement and the sprint action. On the Nasir player's turn, he issues a combined activation of 3 Ashmen. Checking range, he sees all 3 Ashmen can reach the Union Workers and advances them up. Now the Ashman will perform their action. A single Ashman engaging the lone Union Worker will perform his attack first. He rolls a 10, an over result, which will generate 2 hits, induced to the Union Worker's resilience of 1, 2 wounds. the Union Worker is removed as a casualty. When models are removed as casualties, they are placed to the side of the battlefield. For every 3 models slain, that army loses 1 morale. At the end of any round, if an army has 0 or less morale, they lose the game. The 2 remaining Ashmen will now perform what is known as a combined attack. A combined attack happens when 2 or more active models decide to pool their attacks into a single target. When this is done, the total dice from all models participating in the combined attack are gathered together into one large attack. This is useful when infantry need to damage a high resilience model that they otherwise had little chance of hurting on their own. Both Ashmen's sword strike attacks contribute 1 die to the combined attack for a total of 2 dice. It is also important to note that, if any of these attacks had special abilities, they would also be applied to the combined attack. The Nasir player rolls a 2 and a 7. The 2 is an armor result, bouncing harmlessly off the steel plating of the Union Worker. The 7, however, is a strike, dealing the Union Worker 1 damage. Once all models have finished their activation, the Nasir player's turn ends and the Technus player's turn continues by activating their last remaining model, Galvanic Defender. He sees that an Ashmen is already within range of his 8-inch magic attack, so he decides to perform his action before moving, hurling a mighty bolt of power at the Ashmen. It is important to note that a model suffers no adverse effects from shooting into combat with friendly models. He rolls a single die and compares the result to the Ashmen's defense chart. 10, another overpowered result. The Ashmen is slain. The defender now uses his movement to advance up the battlefield. The Nasir player issues a combined activation between his last Ashmen and the Ashmen Hakkar, moving them up into combat. Lone Ashmen performs his action, sprinting into combat with the Galvanic Defender. The Hakkar, meanwhile, performs his attack against the Union Worker. We see here that the Hakkar has 2 dice for his attack. He rolls both and scores a 1 and a 6. The 1 once again bounces off the armor of the Union Worker, but the 6 is a strike, damaging the worker. All models have now activated, so the round ends. Round 2 begins with both players rolling initiative, just like the previous rounds, with play continuing back and forth. If, at the end of any round, the player's morale is 0 or less, that player loses the game. That concludes our tutorial of the basics of Wrath of Kings.